Welcome to our first lecture. In this lecture, we're going to talk about the historical background to the New Testament. We're going to trace from the beginning of our history, since the time of Abraham up to the time of Jesus and Paul. And from there, we are going to see the bigger picture of what is the New Testament is all about. You may be wondering why we need to learn history at the first place. The reason is because human does not live in vacuum. We are constantly being affected by a surrounding factor. And in order to understand the New Testament in its own historical milieu, we need to go back in time to the time of the authors, to the time where these people are living. And in order to understand them better, we need to understand their background. And so some of these things will help us to understand them better. First of all, history, of course, what they went through as a people of God, and what is their historical background. Then you have geography. What is the surrounding geography? How is the topography looks like? Which areas are more important than the rest? And then you have politics. Of course, politics constantly affects our human being and how we see things and how we treat one another. And not to forget religion, and then culture, and of course literary techniques in order to understand how the people compose our New Testament. So these are the elements that we will be learning in this course, and hopefully from gaining from this perspective, we are able to glimpse into the New Testament world and interpret them more accurately. And for this lecture particularly, we are just going to learn about the history. I have divided the timeline into 5 major sections. As you can see on the slide, we have the post-exilic section, then followed by the Hellenistic period, and then Roman period, and end with 2 Jewish revolt. So sit back and enjoy the time travel. Let's start from the very beginning, where we learn to grasp hold of the big story of our faith. Many Christians, they don't realize that actually our story does not begin just from the New Testament alone. We go all the way back to the Old Testament. That's why as Christians, we need to read both Old Testament and the New Testament. And particularly important to us, in the Old Testament, there are 5 covenants that marks the key moments of our faith, of our history. And first of all, we learn about the Noahic covenant. This is where the covenant made between Noah and God. In this covenant, we are introduced to the concept of God who is holy and just, and he hates sin. But yet, God is also merciful. As God judged the sinners, he preserved humanity through the life of Noah and his family. And of course, through this covenant, we also learn about God no longer judges with flood, with the given sign of a rainbow. And that is the first covenant. And in the second covenant, we learn about the Abrahamic covenant. This is the covenant between Abraham and God. And in this covenant, we learn about the concept of fathers of many nations. And from here, we learned about God's chosen people, the concept of election. We are the people under the children of Abraham, God's chosen ones. And from there, we also were introduced to the concept of circumcision, marking themselves, separating themselves away from the pagans, from the Gentiles. Okay? Then the third covenant, which is the Mosaic covenant. This is a very important covenant because through this covenant we learn about God's deliverance. When the people of God under severe persecution, under the lordship of other nations, God will come and intervene, and he will deliver his people away from all this oppression. And through this covenant we also learned that the law of God is given to us. How do we live as a people of God? How do we obey or be obedient to God? Through the practicing of the law of God. And the next covenant, the fourth one, is the Davidic covenant. This is the covenant between David and God, and through this covenant we are introduced to the concept of kingship and kingdoms. And in this covenant we also learn about an eternal kingdom. that God will bring about for his people through the line of David. And here we learn about the Messiah who is to come through the line of David. That's why it's important, if you look at the Gospels, why the authors of the Gospel trace the history of Jesus to the Davidic line. And it's very important because the Messiah has to be born from the line of David, which means the descendant of David. Okay, and finally we have the new covenant. This is a very important covenant for us because Jesus mentioned about this new covenant during the Last Supper. And in this new covenant, and finally God will blot out all the sins of his people and will no longer remember them and forget all these iniquities. And from here, God will make his people and transforming everything new. So these 5 covenants marks the key moments of our history, and they becomes our background as we read our New Testament. So bear these 5 covenants in mind. So let us go back in time into the year 1000 BCE, to the time where King David took over Jerusalem and made it his capital city. His son, King Solomon, then built the first Jerusalem temple for a people of God to worship and to offer sacrifices. However, in the year 921 BCE, the northern Israelite tribes revolted against Solomon and established the northern kingdom. So the northern kingdom is called Israel, where the southern kingdom is called Judah. The northern kingdom then built their own rival temple situated at Mount Gerizim and the rival capital city in Samaria. So this gives you the background for the conversation between Jesus and the Samaritan woman as to which temple to go for worship. Okay, then following that, Assyria rise to power and crushed the northern kingdom in the year 721 BCE. Assyria then deported the people of Israel and imported other subjects peoples in order to weaken the opposition in Israel. And as a result of that, there was a mixed population in Samaria. And that gives you the reason why Jews in the later part of history, they despise the Samaritans because they consider them not as pure Jews anymore. They were mixed breed. And then in the year 587, Babylonian rise to power and conquered the southern kingdom. The capital city Jerusalem and the temple were all destroyed in the same year. The Babylonians took most of the inhabitants in Judah and exiled into Babylonia. That marks the beginning of the Babylonian exile and the beginning of diaspora Jews, where Jews no longer live in their homeland. A more important question for us is that how would Babylonian exile affected the people of God? The first thing we need to talk about is the religion. Since they no longer have the temple, how would they worship God? Now they're in a foreign land, how would they practice their faith? And so they have to reconfigure the way they worship, no longer centered on the temple, but now centered on the practice of the law and the practice of religious custom. Then the second question would be assimilation. Now they are being deported, no longer in their homeland. They are constantly dealing with foreigners in the place they stay. So they are being challenged. Will they follow what their neighbors are doing? Will they believe what their neighbors are believing? Or would they eat food like their neighbors who have no border with clean and unclean food? So the question whether to join in and blend into the society or to resist and start their own community. And so this will be the question that will be dragging up to the first century. Even in the first century, the people of God, the Jews, have to constantly ask whether do we assimilate to the culture of the day or we stick to what we believe. And the third thing will be politics. Now that they are a foreigner in a foreign land, will they still continue to hang on to the thought that one day we will go back and restore the nation and start our own government? Or they will just happily forget about what the dream that God has given to them and be a foreigner in a foreign land. Hopefully the government will treat them well. And fourthly, you have the prophets. During this period of time, the prophets still prophesy to the people and remind the people that they need to be faithful because God will one day restore what He has promised to them. And so this echoes of prophecy continue to linger on up to the first century world as the people of God continue to wait upon God for what God will say and to restore his kingdom as what he promised in the covenant. And finally, the covenant. How would the people of God react to the covenant? Do they still believe that God will do what he said in the covenant, as what he had promised, to build a kingdom? And now that they have no longer have a land, no longer have a nation by themselves, will they still hang on to that covenantal promise? And so these questions that we discuss now, constantly they have to face as they live in exile, and it becomes a very painful experience, yet a very important experience, because they will face similar things even though when we come back and return from exile. We will talk about that later on. After the Babylonian came the Persian. Persian conquered Babylon in the year 539 BCE. King Cyrus the Great that have this wonderful policy, so that in order to get the people to obey him and submit to his authority willingly, he allows those who have been deported to return to their homeland. And by this gesture, hopefully the nations will then submit to his authority. And so the Jews were given the chance to return to Palestine. However, not everyone returned. You have to remember this. That's why there are diaspora Jews even up to today. Not everyone returned to Palestine. And so this marks the beginning of the intertestamental period of 400 years of silence. From the Old Testament, we learn that Zerubbabel and Joshua went back to rebuild the temple in 515 BCE. This is what we call the Second Temple. Then Nehemiah went back to rebuild the wall in 445 BCE. Ezra went back to restore the Torah in 458 or 428 or 398 BCE. It depends on how do you interpret the text. And from here we see the people of God now back to their homeland. They have their own land. Then they have their temple now. The wall was there to give them some sort of protection. And they have the law. It seems that pretty good, isn't it? They have become more like a nation by themselves. Yet, don't forget, they are still under the Persian. Although they have some sort of autonomy, yet they are not free entirely. So that is not the fulfillment of the covenant yet. At this point of history, there was another power rising in the west, led by Alexander the Great. So we will now shift our focus to Greece. In the Athenian Empire, there was a power struggle. During this period of time, the power of Macedon was growing. Philip II seized power in Macedon and began to extend his influence. He was a master in the art of war, so he was able to capture many cities in the northern Greece. Philip, and with his 18-year-old son Alexander, conquered Athens in the year 338 BCE. Now both of them were actually prepared to invade the Persian Empire. However, Philip was murdered before they even started the invasion. And so Alexander ascended to the throne of Macedon when he was just about 20 years old, and he continued the campaign. In the year 334 BCE, Alexander crossed into Asia Minor with about 37,000 infantrymen and 6,000 cavalry. At Granicus River, Alexander won by defeating the Persian and Greek mercenaries. Now this is a very important victory as it opened up all of Asia Minor to the Macedonian conquest. In the year 333 BCE, Alexander won another crucial battle at Issus. Now Issus is located at the crossroad between Asia Minor and Syria. So from this point onward, Alexander went downward. Then in the year 332 BCE, he went down to capture Tyre, thus having control of most of Persian navy. In Tyre, Alexander killed about 9,000 Tyrians, crucifying 2,000 of them, and sold 30,000 into slavery. So it was Alexander who introduced the idea of crucifixion into the Western world. And so from this point onward, Alexander went downwards and continued until he arrived in Egypt. Now the Egyptians, they did not resist him. In fact, they accepted him, and they even proclaimed him as Horus, the son of Osiris. Having said all this, let's talk about Palestine. Palestine now under a new superpower. They're no longer under the Persian, but now they're under the Greeks. With this new superpower, they have new challenges they have to face. And so we will now talk about some of the challenges that they have to face under the Greeks. Now, Alexander built a vast empire, one of the largest, and in order to maintain this vast empire, Alexander introduced the Greek way of life to his entire empire, and so we call it Hellenism. And this is what John William Drain explained about Hellenism. Let me read up for you. Alexander was a fanatic of his own native culture and was genuinely convinced that civilization had reached its ultimate goal with the Greek way of life. He was determined to share it with the whole world, and he took steps to ensure that Greek customs, religions, and philosophy, even the Greek language, would all be adopted throughout his domains. Cities were built everywhere in Greek styles, incorporating Greek temples, theaters, and sport arenas. The way of life that resulted Hellenism was to last for nearly 1,000 years after Alexander's death and have a profound impact on the future course of the whole Western civilization. Hellenism is very important for us to understand because even up to the time of the 1st century, there were very strong influence of Hellenism in the land of Palestine. So what does Hellenism involve? It involved the spreading of Greek language as the lingua franca, the trading language. The Greek language that was spread during Alexander's time was called Koine Greek, which means common Greek. It was a kind of simplified Greek that was made easy for the foreigners to learn. And so our New Testament was actually written in Koine Greek. Then you have the spread of Greek culture, the way they dress, the way they talk, the way they appreciate art, and so on. Now, Greek, they were polytheistic people, they believed in many gods, and so they built temples all over the empire. The Greeks also built infrastructure such as theaters, arenas, and gymnasium throughout the whole empire. Alexander himself even encouraged the general to marry the locals so that through marriage they can build closer relationship to the local people and they would not fight their own spouse, isn't it? And finally, because of the spread of Koine Greek and the influence of Greek is so strong, most people tend to then forget about their mother tongue and begin to pick up Greek. And many people cannot read Hebrew after upon some time. And so the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament that we have, was then translated into Greek, which is called the Septuagint, or LXX, basically means 70. Why this 70? Because there was a story behind it where the scribes in Egypt, in Alexandria, then translated the Old Testament from Hebrew to Greek, and when they came out, 70 of them came to a same conclusion, says they have perfect translation, no error, no dispute, and they say this must be from God. And so this legend about this 70 scribes named this Greek translation as the LXX or Septuagint. Now from this point you can see the Greek way of life became a threat to the Jewish way of life. The way Greek appreciate arts, their nudity, the way they have games, their religion, they totally contradict what the Jews believe as a society. And so the Jews have to struggle whether to assimilate to the Hellenism or not. Now, having said all this, the Jews still remain some form of freedom to practice their own faith. However, such freedom did not last long, as you will see soon. Even Alexander managed to build a vast kingdom. He did not last long. He died very young. And when Alexander died, his only heir was still an embryo. So when people asked him, who would you pass your kingdom to? And of all the things he could said, he said this, to the strongest. And so for 40 years, the former general fought and struggled. There was a very bloody struggle for the control of the empire. As a result of that, the empire was broken into 4 parts, each controlled by a general. In Greek it's called diadochi. Particularly important for our study of the New Testament were the 2 parts of the empire, which are called Ptolemaic Empire and the Seleucid Empire. Ptolemaic Empire was in Egypt, ruled by Ptolemy, and the Seleucid Empire was in Syria, ruled by Seleucus, as you can see in the map. So our focus for the next period of time will be between these 2 kingdoms, these 2 empires, and since, as you can see, Jerusalem was in the middle of these 2. Now Jerusalem was sandwiched between Egypt and Syria, thus became the victim of a rivalry between these 2 empires, the Ptolemaic and the Seleucid. Both of them wanted to collect tax from Jerusalem, and they wanted to make this place as their buffer zone against each other. As you can see, it's very strategic. So at first, Ptolemy dominated Palestine for about 122 years, and Judea was considered as a temple state ruled by the priests. So what they need to do is just pay tax to Ptolemaic governor, and they have their freedom to worship, no problem. However, in the year 198 BCE, Antiochus III, which is also known as Antiochus the Great, won the Battle of Panias and conquered Judea. Under the Seleucids, things were about to change very drastically. It's not the same like before. Now what I'm going to do now is to give you a fast track of events that ultimately bring about the Jewish revolt against the Seleucid government. It all started with the Battle of Magnesia in 198 BCE, where the Romans defeated the Seleucids, Antiochus III. And the Romans forced Antiochus III to pay for reparation. However, he did not do so, but he passed it on to his subject people. And so the Jews were forced to pay that big sum of tax. Then following that, in the year 175 BCE, his son Antiochus IV Epiphanes ascended to the throne. Now, this guy Antiochus IV, he was a real Hellenizer, and he enforced Hellenistic culture on the people. Not only that, after he received bribe, he replaced the current Jewish high priest Onias III with his brother Jason. Now, Jason was a Hellenizer, and later on, he also replaced Jason with Menelaus, another Hellenizer, who offered a higher tax from his subject people. So you can see Antiochus, he not only enforced Hellenistic culture on his people, but he also manipulated the priesthood in the Jewish temple. Then he tried to attack Egypt, but he failed. And so on his way back, he passed Judea. During this period of time, then as he passed through Judea, a civil war broke out between Jason and Menelaus. Remember these 2 high priests that he changed? And so Antiochus interpreted this internal conflict as a kind of revolt against him. He took it personally, probably because of his bitterness of his defeat in Egypt. And so he attacked Jerusalem. He exterminated all the males who resisted him, and he sold all the women and children into slavery. He destroyed the city walls, he teared it down, and then he built a fortified wall against the temple, the old temple. Not only that, he then forbid Jewish religion. This was really, really bad. He forbade the practice of the Torah, and he forbade the custom of circumcisions and other Jewish custom. Then he enforced Hellenistic religion. In every town of Judea, he commanded them to offer sacrifice to the Greek gods. And so he put troops in Jerusalem, and then they brought all the gods together with them to Jerusalem. The most offensive of all is this. On 25th December 167 BCE, he, Antiochus IV, offered a pig at the temple altar to the god of Zeus. The Jewish people consider this as the abomination of desolation, recalling Daniel chapter 11 verse 31, chapter 12 verse 11. This is the worst sacrilege ever. and it became such a painful memory in the mind of the Jews. And so the Jewish people cannot take this anymore. Now here is First Maccabees, a book that is not found in our Protestant Bible, but is found in the Roman Catholic Bible. Maccabees recorded the whole event about Antiochus Epiphanes oppressing the Jewish people. Now, I'm not going to read the whole text with you. You can just pause the video as you read, and once you're done, you can resume it. There is going to be a few pages. But feel the kind of struggle, anger that Antiochus Epiphanes have aroused from the Jewish people, and keep that in mind as we go through the slides later on. I will now talk about the Maccabean Revolt, which was the reactions against Antiochus' oppressive rulership. It all started off in this small little town by the name Modein, whereby Antiochus IV sent a royal agent to urge an elderly old priest by the name of Mattathias. I will now talk about the Maccabean Revolt, which was the reaction against Antiochus' oppressive rulership. It all started off in this small little town by the name Modein, whereby Antiochus IV sent a royal agent to urge this elderly priest by the name Mattathias to set an example for the rest by offering a pagan sacrifice. Of course, Mattathias resisted to comply. However, another guy did comply. And because of that, Mattathias killed this guy who complied, and then he killed the agent, destroyed the altar, and then fled to the mountains with his 5 sons and also those who sympathized with them. So that was the little beginning. However, they eventually became a revolt, which is called the Maccabean Revolt in the year 167 BCE under the leadership of Mattathias' family. Sometimes we call this family as the Hasmoneans because of the name Hasmon, who was the great-grandfather of Mattathias. Or sometimes we also call this group as Maccabees because of the nickname Maccabeus, which means hammer, which we give to Judas, one of the sons of Mattathias. So after Mattathias was killed in the revolt, his son continued the revolt, and they were very successful in guerrilla warfare. In fact, they managed to expel the Seleucid troops from Jerusalem, and then they conquered Palestine. And then in the year 164 BCE, Judas gained the temple. He cleansed the temple and rededicated it back to God on the December 25th, 164 BCE, which is exactly 3 years after the temple was desecrated. Now, this rededication of the temple inaugurated the Feast of Hanukkah, which is also called the Feast of Light. And this revolt became a very important story for all the Jewish people later on. And this reminds them that God is still on their side. God will vindicate his name and clear this land of his from pagan rulers. This is a very, very key story that marks all other messianic revolt in the later story. And so, after the Maccabean Revolt, they were very successful, and since then marks the beginning of the Hasmonean dynasty. The Hasmoneans were very successful, and they were able to take the whole Palestine back to their own hand. However, the well-intention of Mattathias soon turned into a hunger for power and authority. And so during this period of time, they began to have their own Jewish calendar, the mark of the beginning of theocracy. And then they have their own coins, which was minted the last time in 586 BCE. Then they have installed their first priest king, Aristobulus I. And from that point onwards, Jewish people have different opinions towards this dynasty. Some will consider this as not from God, some will consider it as part of God's plan. And so the people were divided themselves. Those who supported the government, they are the Hasmoneans, and later on they became the Sadducees in the New Testament. These are the aristocrats who support the government, who are the pro-government. Well, whereas there are some who are more religious, pious, and consider the Hasmoneans have gone out of the way, they pull themselves away, and this group later on became Pharisees and Essenes in the New Testament. Now, as for the Essenes consider the current temple, the priesthoods are wrong. They are not considered the proper priesthood. So they ran away and started their own community and have their own worship. Whereas the Pharisees stay back and continue to provide religious revival in the land of Palestine. Of course, there were some Jews who don't bother with what is going on as long as they get their piece of meat and enjoy their life. These are the Hellenized Jews who already have assimilated to Hellenism culture. And so, as you can see, after the Hasmoneans, the Jewish people were no longer united. They were a diverse group, and each reacted differently to the Hasmoneans dynasty. We will now trace the event that led to the transitions from the Hasmoneans to the Romans. Now, the Hasmonean rulers were craving for power and authority. Eventually, there broke a civil war between two rulers, Aristobulus II and Hyrcanus II. Now, the Hasmonean rulers have been very oppressive to the general public. They even forced the people to be converted into Judaism. So when Pompey the Great stepped into Judea in the year 63 BCE, he promised peace to the people in Palestine. So can you imagine you're just a local people in Palestine, and there you have civil war between the oppressive ruler. Then came Pompey, who offered peace. It was a gift that irresistible, and so the people generally accepted Pompey and welcomed him into the land. However, definitely Hasmoneans and the religious people consider Pompey rather as a threat. Nevertheless, Pompey showed his power, and he built a siege wall in Jerusalem. He killed the priests and 12,000 Jews and all the resistant groups leaders. Then he entered the temple. He looked around, but he didn't touch anything, and he said there's nothing in the temple actually. And more importantly, he appointed Hyrcanus II as the high priest, marking the end of the civil war. So from this point onwards, the Roman took over, became the new superpower governing Palestine. Then Antipater took advantage of this whole situation. Antipater was an Idumean, and he supported Hyrcanus II, and he was a good friend of Caesar. From then on, Antipater took over and became the ruler in Palestine. Antipater has two sons. Their names were Phasael and Herod. So Phasael led Judea and Herod led Galilee. However, after Antipater died, the two sons joined to rule the province together. Now, at this point of time, the Parthians fought Roman in Syria in the year 40 BCE. And in the midst of this, Jerusalem was captured by the Parthians. Hyrcanus II was exiled, and Phasael, one of the sons of Antipater, was killed in the process. The second son of Antipater, Herod, then fled down to south to Alexandria. From then on, he went to Rome and he sought counsel with Caesar. He was very, very smart. And there, he was declared the king of the Jews. In the year 37 BCE, Herod then returned to Jerusalem to take this land for himself. This was Herod, the king of the Jews, also known to us as Herod the Great. Let me introduce Herod the Great to you. Herod the Great was a great builder. He built some of the magnificent buildings in the land of Palestine. One of it is called the New Harbor of Caesarea, where he built this harbor in honor of Caesar. It was a magnificent harbor. Another important building that he did was the reconstruction of Jewish temple. Now, he didn't really build the temple per se, but he renovated it. Remember that the people mentioned about the second temple lost its honor compared to the first? Now, Herod the Great, after he renovated this temple, it was so huge and magnificent. Later, you will see a picture of it. Having said that, he was also an insecure ruler. He built a series of fortresses around Judea just to protect his kingdom. To show you how insecure he was, he also killed 2 of his own wives and at least 3 of his own sons for fearing that they conspire against him. So there was a saying that it was better to become Herod's pig than his son. For Herod, at least he did not eat pork. So altogether, Herod executed more than 45 Hasmoneans, fearing that they are conspiring against him. With this in mind, it is not surprising that when Jesus was born, he ordered for the killing of the babies and children, based on his own insecurity. But he was also a very smart and cunning politician. When he knew that Mark Antony is losing favor and Augustus is gaining favor from Caesar, he quickly switched allegiance. And he even established secret police, curfew, and high tax to control the land. But during time of famine, he will give a free grain and free clothes to please the heart. So he knew when to push, when to pull. And he died in the year 4 BCE. And it's important for us to know because we knew that Jesus was born in the rulership of Herod. And so, in other words, Jesus must have been born before 4 BCE. We may conjecture probably Jesus was born in 4 to 8 BCE. Now, Herod had 3 sons named Archelaus, Antipas, and Philip. When Herod died, these 3 sons took over his rulership. That means the whole kingdom is separated by these 3 sons. We will encounter them as we read the New Testament, especially in the Gospel. For example, Mary and Joseph went to Egypt in order to escape from Archelaus. Now, Archelaus, he ruled Judea and he was a brutal ruler. And then we know about John the Baptist was killed by Antipas. Jesus was declared as the Son of God in Caesarea in Philippi, which was the region governed by Philip. Okay, so these 3 sons then took over from Herod the Great after that. Now here is the model of the second temple. As you can see, it is a huge temple. Of course, by the time of Jesus, it's still going through the renovation. But as you can see, the main structure over there, it was huge. Then if you look at the comparison between the Solomon temple and Herod's temple, imagine those days people already praised Solomon temple as was such a great temple, such a beautiful temple. Look at how big and huge Herod temples looks like. And so if you can look at this is the map of Jerusalem, the temple is situated at the top here. Okay? And Herod fortress were here because he was very insecure. He built a fortress around himself just to protect himself. So you can look at how huge is this temple. It becomes one of the main symbols and attraction point for people coming to Jerusalem. Here we have a table giving you a summary of the divisions in Herod's kingdom. Herod the Great, who is the son of Antipater, he was the king of Judea. He ruled from 37 to 4 BCE. Now these 3 sons, Herod Archelaus, Philip, and Herod Antipas, divide the kingdom of Herod. Herod Archelaus was the oldest son, and he was given the responsibility to be the ethnarch of Judea, Samaria, and Idumea. But because he was a ruthless ruler, until people cannot take it and reported him to Caesar, and so he was exiled after that. So his rulership was quite short, from 4 BCE to 6 CE. Whereas Philip was the son of Herod and with Cleopatra of Jerusalem. He was the tetrarch of territories north and east of the Sea of Galilee. And you can see the dates of reign from 4 to 34 CE. And finally, Herod Antipas, the youngest son of Herod the Great, who is also the second husband of Herodias. Now, Herod Antipas was a tetrarch of Galilee and Perea from 4 BCE to 39 CE. Now, if you look at the map, which I take from one of the Holman Bible Atlas, take note of these three colors. Purple color, these are the sections given to Antipas. The red color given to Archelaus, and finally the brown color given to Philip. So make sure you remember these three sections clearly. Now, after Archelaus was exiled in 6 CE, Judea then became an imperial province governed by a Roman prefect. That means Roman will assign a ruler over Judea. And so it started off with Coponius, Marcus Ambivius, Annius Rufus, Flavius Gratus, and of course, Pontius Pilate. He was the person who was the governor during the time when Jesus was tried and crucified. And finally, Marullus. So after Marullus came Herod Agrippa I. It was in the year 41 CE where Claudius ascended as the new emperor after Caligula. And Claudius made Herod Agrippa I as king over Judea. Now, Herod Agrippa was actually the grandson of Herod the Great. Now, Herod Agrippa relived the glory of his grandfather. He inherited all the land of Judea, including the land previously governed by Antipas and Philip. And Herod was loved by the people because he showed pietism towards the Jewish faith. However, in the year 44 CE, someone called Herod as like a god, and then a lightning from heaven struck him dead. So that's how unfortunate it is. And his son was then just too young. He was only 17. And therefore, Judea turned back into an imperial province after that. As I mentioned, after King Agrippa first died in 44 CE, Judea returned back to become an imperial province governed by a Roman procurator. Here is the list: Cuspius Fidus, Tiberius Alexander, Cumanus, M. Antonius Felix, Porcius Festus, Albinus, and finally Gaius Florus. And during this period of time, the people in Judea became more and more restless against Roman rulership, and eventually it turns to be a revolt against the Roman. Now, Wenham and Bolton gave us a very good summary of what the events happened that eventually bring about the Jewish revolt. And just let me read it for you. The following period of rule by Roman governors was turbulent. Fadus put down and beheaded a prophet called Theudas, who promised to lead people dry foot through the Jordan to conquer the promised land. Tiberius Alexander crucified 2 sons of Judas the Galilean, and presumably for nationalist violence. His governorship was marked by a particularly severe period of famine. Cumanus presided over various troubles, including an incident in Jerusalem where a soldier offended Jewish sensitivity, leading to a disturbance in which, according to Josephus, 20,000 people were killed. There were also major tensions between Jews and Samaritans. The governorship of Felix saw more unrest in Palestine, with groups of revolutionaries, of zealots, such as the Sicarii who specialized in assassinations, and religious prophets, including a Jew from Egypt, being active and gaining support. Felix was ruthless in response. He was followed in office by Festus, Albinus, and Florus, whose brutal and rapacious rule triggered rebellion and the Jewish war. The Jews fought fiercely and hoped for a Maccabean-style deliverance, but it did not come, and the infighting between different groups in Jerusalem did nothing to help. In AD 70, the Jerusalem was captured, the temple was destroyed and burned down. Now, from this summary, we can see that throughout the time, even after Jesus, there were people claimed to be Messiah, Savior, who would be able to bring back the glory of the old time. You can see the story of Maccabees still kept on ringing even up to this point of time, and finally bring about the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 CE. So let me just tell you some of the events that happened after the Jewish revolt. The Jewish revolt reached a climax in 70 CE where the Romans destroyed the temple. Then followed by Herodian fell in 71 CE and Macarius fell in 74 CE. Legend says that there were 960 defenders at Masada. They're not willing to bow down to the Romans. So they decided to commit suicide rather than surrendering to the Romans that surrounded them. And during this period of time, Romans deported the Jews away from Judea. And because of that, the religious scenes of Jewish people have totally changed, even the Christians. They no longer have a temple. So the Jewish people have to find another way to reconfigure themselves in terms of worshipping. So they are now concentrate on observation of the Torah as a replacement of temple worship. And the Jewish people have to reorganize themselves into Great Synod, we call it Rabbinic School at Jamnia, and also introduce measure to exclude the Christians from the synagogue. We will now trace the events that led up to the Second Jewish Revolt. Under Emperor Hadrian, Rome decided to rebuild Jerusalem as a Roman colony. So the city was rebuilt in a Roman style, bringing in Roman temples and gods. And so they even erected a temple to the Roman god Jupiter at the place where the Jewish temple was once stood. And then Hadrian allowed the Jews to return. However, he didn't allow the Jews to practice their custom. And so he even forbade circumcisions from the Jews. And so the Jews revolted against him, and led by Bar Kokhba. Bar Kokhba basically means son of the star. And people at the time believed that this was the Messiah who about to bring the promise of God into fulfillment, where God will finally act and liberate his people. However, the revolt was crushed in 135 CE. And then Rome built Jerusalem into a total Roman city called Aelia Capitolina. They even banned the Jews from entering from this city. And since then, Jewish states ceased to exist until its revival in 1948. We have finally come to the end of our first lecture. I hope that through this lecture you'll be able to connect the dots from the Old Testament up to the New Testament. And from here, I'm just giving you a short wrap-up for our lecture today. I hope that through this lecture you'll be able to think and feel like one living in the first century world. This will be your background, the past history that the Jewish people have went through. Try to feel and imagine why they were so agitated with certain things, and why would they love certain things so much. And so everything happens because of certain things happen in history. So bear in mind all these things. And so the exile experience particularly is very important. Why the Jewish people were so concerned with the law is because of the exile. Because they disobeyed the law at the first place, that brings them to the exile. And now in order to return from exile, they have to be strict obedience to the law. And that gives you a reason why in the New Testament world we see the Jewish people were so strict to the law. Then we also see the transition of temple worship to obedience to the Torah. And then we see the marks of the Jewish people, the identity, the land, and the temple. These three things the Jewish people were willing to even die for. And why? Because of the covenant experience, because of the exile experience. And so remember this history. Then finally, we learn about political tension about the Jews in the first century world. Remember what we talked about the Hasmoneans? Different people reacted to the Hasmoneans differently, and that gave rise to different branches of Judaism. Those who supported the Hasmoneans, the aristocrat became the Sadducees, whereas the pious one, the religious people, they are not for the government, and they became the Essenes and the Pharisees. And then they give rise to these different branches of Judaism. We will encounter these branches of Judaism in the first century world as we read the New Testament. So we will learn more about the Jews and the Romans in the coming lectures, but hopefully from this lecture at least you have a better perspective and a good background of the historical events they bring about up to the time to where Jesus was born, and even up to the time of Paul and his epistles. So see you in the next lecture.